Hi, everyone, and welcome to God's Plan, Your Part, a podcast where our goal is to read the entire Bible in a year, seeking to understand God's plan of redemption while discovering daily and practically your part in it.
Have you ever wondered or even doubted if Jesus actually rose from the dead? Well, the good news is you're in good company and you're not the first person to wrestle with it. Today we're looking at 1 Corinthians 15 and 16, and that is exactly why these chapters were written.
So you brought up an interesting point right before we started recording that I did not realize before. This was the first actual account before the Gospels had even written about what happened to Jesus, which that was news to me.
Yeah, these are written about 15 years after Jesus rose from the dead. So 1 Corinthians 15 is the first written record that we have. And it is, like you already said, that it's written earlier than the Gospels were. That's
kind of weird, though, because you would think like such a significant event, it took them 15 years to figure out how to put all that together. That seems kind of nuts.
So that's a common pushback. And it makes sense that you'd be curious about that. The reason that it was not written down is because it was not primarily a writing culture. A lot of these people were telling each other about the resurrection of Jesus almost immediately. And the apostles go right to work preaching the gospel as soon as Jesus tells them to and ascends into heaven. So we're dealing with a spoken word culture. A lot of people could not read, so it actually makes sense that we don't have written accounts from that period of time. It also could be that there were written accounts, but we just don't have them. Like, we know that 2 letters had already been passed back and forth to the Corinthians, but we don't have those letters, so maybe those talked about the resurrection. At any rate, 1 Corinthians 15 is about the resurrection to people that were saying, we're not sure that this is even real.
So as we move into the next part of the chapter, because I read chapter 16 today, and quite honestly, there's just a lot of formalities as Paul's ending his letter. So I feel like unless there's something sticking out to you later, I don't really feel like I need to address it. But as we move into chapter 15 a little bit further, there is talk about resurrection of the dead, and he's really calling people out, specifically the Corinthians out, about their misunderstandings of being raised from the dead. And it's just if you believe that people aren't raised, believers aren't raised from the dead, then Christ isn't either. Can you explain that to me? Why was this such a confusion?
So just like I referenced earlier, the letters, there were previous letters. And so Paul has some understanding of what's being taught or what's being doubted or wrestled with. And apparently there was a group of, we can assume, believers, a group of people who received the gospel that were either wrestling through doubts or actively teaching that there is no resurrection of the dead. And this was not a unique Corinthian belief. The Sadducees actually believed that when Jesus was around. And the Greeks, I think, had different elements among themselves, the Greeks and the Romans, that would have taught this is not possible. Obviously, even today, people will teach that this is not possible. It's not strange that people would teach that you cannot raise from the dead. So what gets Paul's attention
I guess what caught my attention is just that it's believers that are saying this.
Exactly. What gets Paul's attention is that believers in the church are saying this, and Paul's hey, our forgiveness for sin is literally pinned on Jesus' resurrection. So if you start teaching people that Jesus did not rise from the dead, then you would also, de facto be teaching people that they are not forgiven of sin.
Well, that completely discredits the sacrifice that Jesus made then too. If we assume that you aren't raised from the dead, then why did he die in the first place? It doesn't even make sense.
Exactly. And this is important to us still today, because there are still today people that will be well, yeah, I really appreciate the teachings of Jesus, but I'm not really into all the supernatural stuff, or I don't think there were actually miracles. If you remove the resurrection of Jesus, you remove the power that he showed over sin and death. And so you can't be justified before God without Christ's sacrifice. So if somebody is teaching that, or if somebody is starting to believe that, you are undermining the quintessential fact of our faith. And that's why Paul takes this very seriously. You'll notice 1 Corinthians 15, the language is a little bit wordy, and he makes the same point several times. He really, really wants them to understand this.
Well, sorry, go ahead.
Well, basically through Adam, we inherit death, and through Jesus, we inherit life. Like he talks about like Adam brought us sin and death, Jesus brought us life and forgiveness, and will be perishable through Adam, but imperishable through Jesus.
Well, I was just about to mention that, actually. So we move into the next section about resurrection, the resurrected body. And I guess it's like, it probably is for us too. I mean, how many times do we say, like, I don't know, like assuming what you'll look like and assuming what you'll be like? These were also questions that people had then. And Paul actually calls them foolish, you foolish person, to ask questions like, how are the dead raised? What kind of body do they come? With what kind of body do they come? And he's basically just saying, like, there's no way to understand what it will be like. Your natural bodies won't have a place, because your natural bodies, obviously, our Bible says that we are subject to sickness, we're subject to death and eventual decay. How can we live eternally with a physical body like that? So there will be this change that happens, but like, who are we to say then even what that's like? So it's interesting that they were facing a lot of these questions too.
And it makes sense. They'd be like, okay, so I'm going to live forever, but like, what will my body be like? And these are not people that have been learning this in church for years and years and years. Or they're not people that have at least been exposed to Christian culture for years and years and years. They're like, okay, like I'm into this, but this part doesn't make sense. So Paul explains to them, but you know, he's not giving them science. He's not giving them A plus B equals C, saying, hey, we will rise from the dead and we'll have imperishable bodies. I don't know exactly how that's going to work, but I believe it's going to happen. And Paul actually says that his life is so pinned to this, that if it wasn't real, his whole life is a waste of time.
So what comes to mind then is like the basis of all of this, which is that our bodies are perishable because of sin and death. And if they're going to be these imperishable things, there has to be some change. The reason we're in these perishable bodies is because of sin separating us from God, and because Jesus was put on the cross, died for our sins as that substitute. We will have freedom and an imperishable body as believers.
Fun fact, most likely Jesus is already has one of those imperishable bodies, because he rises from the dead. And the interesting thing about him is that his body is still marked by the physical elements. Like Thomas is able to put his hands like,
but they didn't recognize him.
Yeah, that's true. They did eventually though.
Yeah, but it took him a long time. He walked alongside on the road with them, and they were like, dur, dur, dur.
So there's something different about him. And he rises into heaven in that body. So that's how he is and how he exists today. So speaking of those accounts, we kind of sped past this, but it is important. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 3.
Wow.
These are, back at the beginning. These are like Paul's firsthand accounts of people who had seen Jesus. And these are really important details because he's reporting them, referencing the fact that a lot of the people that saw Jesus are still alive. If you look at verse 6, he says, then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Like he's basically saying, hey, a lot of people saw this happen. They're still walking around talking to people. They're still preaching the gospel. They're still like, if you have doubts, go talk to some of those people that saw him. So what a powerful testimony, to actually just go bump into somebody that was like, oh yeah, I saw that happen. Like that really did happen.
It says, for Paul, last of all, as one untimely born, he also appeared to me. Mm-hmm. So like, is that the part where it's like Saul's conversion?
Yeah, he's referring to his conversion. And
that's why he says his untimely born.
Exactly.
Interesting.
That is his claim to being an apostle as well. So like the authority of his teaching is tied to his personal like interaction, revelation of Jesus. So he is an apostle in the same way that the first disciples are apostles, and that is his claim to authority.
Wow.
So we are finished up with 1 Corinthians 15. The chapter 16 is basically a wrap up. There is a quick little interesting piece, I think, about him collecting money to give to the believers in Jerusalem, showing how generous the early church was and how that generosity spread as the gospel spread. So these Corinthian believers are being encouraged to put away money the first day of every week to be able to be given to the believers in Jerusalem because they were under persecution, having a really difficult time. Also in chapter 16, verse 21, you'll see one of Paul's favorite ways to end his letters. He says, I, Paul, write this greeting in my own hand. Most likely, if you imagine the letter, like he wrote some special way, like basically a signature, so that people could see this is Paul's writing and we believe it is him. So as far as your part, if there is no resurrection, everything we're doing is pointless. So remind
Sounds
yourself
like
to
Ecclesiastes.
remind yourself of the power and importance of the resurrection. It did happen. It will happen in the future, and from time to time, maybe it still happens today. So be encouraged, and we'll be back again tomorrow with 2 Corinthians. We'll see you then. Thanks so much for listening to God's Plan, Your Part. If anything stuck out to you, if you have any questions, or if you'd like to receive a Bible, you can email us at godsplanyourpart@gmail.com. Also, if you're enjoying the podcast, please consider supporting us through the link in our description. We love that you're on this journey with us, and we hope you have a great day. See you tomorrow.